Welcome to Who Shaves the Barber, a weekly podcast where we explore paradoxes, thought experiments, and other pointless problems. I'm William Nava.
This is the second half of my interview with philosopher Stephen Reed. Last week, in the first half, he went over the general form of the liar paradox and some of its history, including some of its more influential solutions in the 20th century. In this episode, he's going to talk about medieval solutions, in particular, his preferred solution by Thomas Bradwardine. As usual, I do recommend listening to the first part first, especially if you're not super familiar with the liar paradox and its popular solutions. The other thing I want to say is that there's a moment where Stephen Reed goes through Bradwardine's argument line by line, and it can be hard to follow, only because it is a fairly subtle, abstract logical argument with a number of moving parts and different steps. And I don't want people to need to follow every step of that argument in order to understand the general strategy and the significance of the Bradwardine solution. So I think that comes across perfectly fine in the interview. However, if you do want to follow kind of every detail of the argument and you have a hard time doing so with the verbal presentation, I am releasing, along with the podcast, a written version. So in the post where I released the episode, which you can find also at williamnava.com, you'll see a written version of the argument there. And if you see the video version of this interview as well, in the part where Stephen is given the argument, I'm including in the video a kind of line-by-line representation of the argument, using a little bit of symbolism, but not much. I tried to make it something that would be accessible to people who don't have any kind of training in formal logic or anything like that. So I hope that helps. If you do want to follow every step of Bradwardine's argument, it is a really clever and really subtle argument. So I think it's worth going through step by step if you have a taste for that sort of thing. And now, Stephen Reed on medieval solutions to the liar. Okay, so now let's now move backwards in time to the medieval period. So, as was mentioned earlier, during the medieval period, the liar paradox was somewhat of an active problem, and that to some extent was forgotten until certain times in the 20th century. Can you give something of a broad picture of what the approaches were?
Yes, I suppose I'd like to sort of preface that by saying something about medieval logic. Medieval logic, there are antecedents to it, but really things get going in the 12th century, particularly in Paris and Oxford are the two big centers of learning in the 12th century, and people rediscover the paradoxes. They call them insolubles, meaning, and they have a long discussion about what does insoluble mean. It doesn't mean they can't be solved. It means they're just very difficult to solve. So they're optimists all the time, thinking that there is a solution, and they are one of the strands of medieval logic. As I've mentioned before, there's a philosophy of language going on in Middle Ages, and they start to introduce a whole new set of concepts in order to analyze natural language. And the theory of consequence is one of those. The theory of consequence, the theory of what is the validity of arguments. You get a long series of developments, and that runs through certainly into the 15th century, and then with the Renaissance, apart from a few places where the study of these things continues in for example, Spain in the 16th and even the 17th century, logic very much falls out of fashion, and that's why we've lost a lot of interest in these problems. They were thought to be strange things that only these ancient people got excited about, and moderns are much more interested in rhetoric and poetry and ethics and other matters. So think of the period as running roughly from 1150 to 1450 or so. And as I say, right at the beginning of this, you had the insolubles, and really, people think that pretty much the period divides in two as the before Bradwardine and after Bradwardine. And Bradwardine comes up with his solution in the early 1320s as a very young man at Oxford. Before that, largely there were just two approaches, the main ones, and they have two rather strange names. One's called restrictio, which is in English restrictionism, not perhaps quite such a strange word, and the other one is cassatio, which in Scottish English at least is cassationism. But I'm told that lawyers still use the word to cass in Scottish law to mean something becomes null and void. Mm. So cassationism is basically says that when you say something like "what I'm saying is false," you've not said anything at all. There are complications that you can make about that. One of the theories that I've been looking at recently says it still has meaning. It's just that its meaning doesn't stops it being a proposition. It's not doing what something needs to be a proposition, and a proposition is what's true or false. So it doesn't satisfy the criterion for becoming something suitable to be true or false, even though it's got meaning. Whereas that's quite a late theory. The earlier theories of cassationism, cassatio, were more likely just to say that it doesn't have any meaning at all. You failed to say anything coherent. That's cassationism. Restrictio was to say, oh, you have said something coherent, but when you tried to refer to the very same proposition, what I'm saying is false. You can't do that. You failed. You must be referring to some other proposition, which you might say it's raining outside. What I'm saying is false, meaning you were pulling someone's leg when you said it was raining outside, referring to your previous utterance. So the restrictionism says self-reference, at least in the presence of semantic predicates, is impossible. Some people went stronger. Self-reference is impossible, they said. So those are the two dominant theories until the early 1320s, and then Bradwardine writes this treatise on insolubles, where the first 5 chapters are spent castigating these previous theories. He spends 2 whole chapters rubbishing restrictionism in extended detail, and then he spends another chapter or so dealing with cassationism and some of the other theories. There were 2 or 3 other theories around at the time, with some of whom. Part of the problem here is he will attack a solution without saying who holds it. So we hunt around looking to see, did anyone ever actually hold this theory? Perhaps they did, but in a number of cases we haven't actually found the person who actually adopted this theory.
Now, for these people, there's no distinction the way there has been in the 20th century of formal versus informal reasoning, or is there?
They don't have the concept of a formal language at that point. That's perhaps slightly too strong a statement, because in fact they're all writing in Latin, and the Latin they're writing in is almost becoming an artificial language itself. It's not a vernacular language in medieval Europe, so they would be talking, some sort of form of English or some sort of French, in every day, and then when they got in the classroom, they'd all start talking Latin in this very regimented, formal sort of way. But they don't see it as a formal language in the way that in the 20th century we laid down rules, as I said, for the grammar and the vocabulary and the syntax. They just simply had a rather strained and artificial way of forming their Latin, but it was still a natural language, but a rather stilted one.
Mm-hmm. Now, I want to maybe ask something about the the restrictivists or restrictionists. So the idea that self-reference, at least in language, sorry, I have a siren passing by me. So the idea that self-reference is impossible or incoherent is one that I've heard a lot when discussing the liar, and there seems to be some intuitive pull to the idea that if you try to refer to the very thing you're saying, that you're not really saying anything, that's sort of empty or groundless. What do you think about that idea and how much water it can hold?
I mean, it was quite popular at one time in the 20th century as well. I mean, some people call it the namely rider solution. So someone starts to say, what I am saying, and you interrupt them and say, well, what are you saying? Namely, and they ask you to specify what the sentence is that you're trying to refer to. Well, this sentence, which sentence, this sentence, which sentence? You haven't said a sentence yet, and you stop the person saying the sentence before they can get it out. That's quite a common ploy, and it was a popular ploy in the Middle Ages as well. To think that, as you say, there's a pull to this idea. In the 20th century, as I don't know whether you've discussed this with any of your other correspondents, but Gödel's famous theorem in 1930-31 manages to set up a very strictly regimented way in which you do have sentences of arithmetic referring to themselves in a way that made it very, very hard to say that self-reference is impossible. Here was a man who had actually formulated a mathematical theory in which self-reference was built in and undeniable. That's the same, of course, not true in the Middle Ages, where these things are working at a much more intuitive level. But there was some pull to this, and of course the argument is there. Well, if it was unrestricted, we'd be landed in contradiction. Contradiction obviously can't be true. Therefore, there must be some constraints on what you can refer to in the way of self-reference. And if perhaps this sentence has 5 words is a famous benign self-reference. It seems maybe those are all right, but this sentence is false is obviously a malign self-reference and shouldn't be allowed. And the fact that you get into contradiction just shows that something's gone wrong, and maybe that's what it is, allowing sentences or supposing that sentences can refer to themselves in such ways.
Right. Although finding what should be so different about the sentence is false versus the sentence has 5 words seems difficult. No. What in principle, right?
But what's so different is that one's in leads to contradiction, the other one doesn't.
Right. Although that would be. I mean, if that was your reasoning, then that would be ad hoc, right? As a solution.
That was a charge. It was a level at them that says it's ad hoc, which is why some people went stronger and banned all self-reference, because then at least it couldn't be ad hoc. So even the benign self-reference, that there must be something inherently wrong in this very attempt to self-refer. Maybe it looks as if you can do this, but maybe we really are mistaken when we look at sentences and suppose we've actually managed to do it.
Yeah. So I mean, for me, the intuitive idea, if we're talking in just about informal language, that a statement like this sentence has 5 words, or even the sentence is false, just seems to actually be meaningful. Like I understand what is being said, is strong enough for me not to take that idea too seriously. But I think it's worth exploring. So I had interrupted you, but you were about to go into Bradwardine himself.
Right. Okay. Well, so that Bradwardine then starts in chapter 6 saying, right, having got rid of all these other stupid attempts at solution, now I'm going to give the the true solution. And it's based on two principles, which come together in the idea that a sentence can say more than might at first appear. So when I say, for example, all philosophers are very clever, it doesn't have to be a true sentence. Just take that sentence at random. Implicitly in that, I've said that Descartes was very clever. I didn't say it explicitly, but it presumably follows from what I said. And so you might think that implicitly I've said that Descartes was very clever and Locke was very clever and Russell was very clever and so on. I've said all those things simply by uttering the words, all philosophers are very clever. So Bradwardine's idea is, well, what unites this class of all the things that I've said, including the implicit ones? His idea was what he puts down as his second postulate. The second postulate is that every sentence means anything which follows from anything it means. So take the sentence, all philosophers are very clever. That clearly means all philosophers are very clever, but it follows from that, together with the fact that Descartes was a philosopher, that Descartes was very clever. And so that's another of the, we found one of the other things that it means. That's the first idea. The second idea is his theory of truth. And he said, well, what's required for a sentence to be true? Surely it must be that everything it means has got to hold. It wouldn't be enough just that all philosophers are very clever. Wouldn't be enough to make all philosophers very clever true. Also, Descartes would have to be very clever for that to be true, and Russell would have to be very clever for that to be true. All those things that are implicit in it have got to hold as well for a sentence to be true. So the sentence is true if and only if things are wholly as it says they are, and it's false if anything it says, implicit or explicit, fails to be the case. That's his definition of truth. So put those two things together, then he's able to go through an argument to produce his main theorem, because maybe I should have said a little bit about Bradwardine. So before we get a rather tricky technical argument, it's not that long, but it's quite hard to take in. Let's simply remind ourselves, who was this chap, Thomas Bradwardine? Well, he was basically a mathematician. There's a set of people called the Oxford calculators, or the Merton calculators, who were all at Merton between about 1320 and 1350, and they made amazing advances in mathematical physics. And historians of science get very excited about the Oxford calculators. A lot of those calculators, before they made their great advances in mathematical physics, they actually also did logic and wrote actually about the insolubles, and Bradwardine's one of them. So there he is as a young man writing perhaps his first treatise. And being a mathematician, he'll set down his definitions, he'll set down his postulates, and then he'll start proving his theorems. And his second theorem says that any sentence which says of itself that it's false also says of itself that it's true and is false. So let's unpack that. Take any sentence which says of itself that it's false, like, say, the liar sentence, this sentence is false. Bradwardine's going to prove that that sentence also says of itself that it's true. Obviously, that's going to be one of the implicit things that it says. Therefore, it's going to say both. It's going to say of itself both that it's true and that it's false. But nothing can be both true and false. Right? So things can't be wholly as it says they are. So it must be simply false by that definition of truth and falsehood. Falsehood is if anything it says fails, it's false. Well, if it says both that it's true and that it's false, not both of those things can hold. So one of them must fail. So it's false. So we have an argument using the closure principle that I referred to just now. I didn't call it that, so I'll remind you. The closure principle was every sentence means anything which follows from anything it means. So if a sentence means something and something else follows from it, it means that too. That's a closure principle, closure of meaning under consequence and under what follows from it. So
lost you there for a moment, but we can continue right where we left off.
Right. I thought maybe it's worth pausing for a moment to say, if this solution is going to work, we've got something really quite remarkable relative to what we were saying about the 20th century. Remember, in the 20th century, we were faced with the possibility of this infinite hierarchy of languages in Tarski, or even if we could avoid it with Kripke, there was still a ghost of the hierarchy. Whereas if Bradwardine's solution works, we'll get a semantically closed solution to the paradoxes without any hierarchy at all. So if this works, and I'm not yet convinced that it doesn't work, which is why I've made such a noise about it over the last 15 years or so. I think it's not only seems to be a viable solution, but such an excitingly radical one in terms of what it's able to achieve. No hierarchy, no worries with a semantically closed language. We pack it all into the theory of meaning. So
and also no abandoning bivalence, which is important, right? No, we don't have to sacrifice the idea that every sentence is either true or false, and not both.
Yes, that's fact. I said that the closure postulate is Bradwardine's second postulate. His first postulate is every sentence is true or false, right? So right at the heart of it is every sentence is true or false. And the other postulates are all really to do, well, one is to say, the third one says self-reference is possible, which is his reply to the restrictionists and the cassationists, and the fourth, fifth, and sixth are basic logical principles of a familiar sort. But it's a clever argument which takes some following through. So take a sentence which says of itself that it's false. We're not talking about any particular sentence now. I mean, the liar sentence might be one of them, but this is arbitrary. Any sentence that says of itself that it's not true. Let's suppose first that that's all it says. It doesn't say anything else. It just simply says of itself that it's not true. And let's suppose that it's false. Well, in fact, let's suppose that it's not true. Maybe that's the better way to put it. Let's suppose that it's not true. Then, by the definition of of truth, something it means must fail to be the case, right? Because that was true. It's true if and only if everything it means is the case. We're supposing it's not true, so something it means must fail. But we're supposing it only means one thing, namely it's not true. Right? So it fails to be the case that it's not true, that is, it's true. So supposing it's not true, it follows that it's true. But we also suppose that it means that it's not true, and we've got the second postulate that says it also means anything that follows from what it means. So it must also mean that it's true. So it means not only that it's not true, it also means that it's true. Now, that was on the hypothesis that the only thing it means is it's not true. And we've shown that hypothesis must be wrong, because if it did only mean that, it wouldn't only mean that, it would mean something else as well. So, turn to the second leg of the argument, take this sentence, it means of itself that it's not true, but it must also mean something else as well. Right? Bradwardine says, call out B as C. I've kind of say that's a bit complicated. Why don't I say P for the other thing it means? So it says of itself that it's not true, and P is the other stuff it says. And again, suppose it's not true. Then something it means must fail to be the case, and it means that it's not true, and it means that P. So either not true or P must fail. Right? So supposing it's not true, it's not the case that not true and P, well, the fourth principle says we can use De Morgan's laws to take that negation through the conjunction. So if it's not the case that it's not true and P, it's either true or not P. So if it's not true, then either not P or it's true. Another bit of logical manipulation moves that not P to the front, so we get if it's not true and P, then it's true. That is hard to see in thinking mentally here. Yeah. We've got if it's not true, then either not P or it's true is the same as if not true and P, then it's true. Mm-hmm. But we're supposing that it means not true and P. So by the closure principle, it must also mean true. So again, we've shown that if it means that it's not true, it also means that it's true. And now we've shown that categorically now. So we've shown of any sentence that means of itself that it's not true, also means of itself that it's true. But it can't be both true and not true. So it can't be whole, things can't be wholly as it says they are. So it's not true. And so by bivalence, it's false. So any sentence that means of itself that it's not true or false means of itself that it's true and is false. And that's Bradwardine's total solution to the paradox. Any such paradox, and not just the liar paradox, but all the paradoxes that people come up with are going to simply be false.
Right. So I will imagine that some people will not sort of follow all of the specifics of that argument, and I don't want this to be this discussion to be contingent on following every step of it.
Exactly.
I think that maybe the takeaway is to take that the crucial step is this idea of the sentence meaning more than it at first appears to say, right? So the first step of the argument is to show that no matter what, this sentence in fact says more than simply that it is false.
Good. Yes.
What it does in fact mean, other than that it is false, is actually, perhaps among other things, but is that it is true.
Yes.
Right.
And shows that in fact it's contradictory. It's a contradictory sentence, and contradictions can't be true. So all these insolubles are false. That's the takeaway.
Right. And that cannot be true, right? Because we have it as a principle that contradictions can't be true. And of course, this is so. Maybe one thing that one might think is, well, we knew this was a paradox anyway. We knew this involved contradiction, but in the liar, as we normally think of it, when we think of it normally as just saying that it is false, that allows us to derive a contradiction. Whereas in this case, we're taking the sentence to in fact say a contradiction, which is not a paradox. It's simply something that we can call just false because it's a contradiction and sort of move on. Would you say that that's all accurate?
Yes. Good.
Okay. So it seems then that the crucial steps for this solution are this approach to truth, which says that truth is actually, a sentence is true if everything that it says is the case. And along with the closure principle, right, that a sentence means everything that follows from it.
Yes. Right.
So let me go into each of those a little bit.
Yes.
Maybe let's start with the one about truth. Can you talk about in what sense this is different from Tarski's notion of truth, and why that ends up mattering?
In fact, I think it's actually very close to what Tarski says, and unfortunately, Tarski didn't realize this. Because if you remember, I said that the heart of Tarski's theory of truth is that your theory of truth must deliver every theorem of the form S is true if and only if P, where what replaces S is a name of an object language sentence, and what replaces P is a translation of that into the meta language.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Now, you'll also probably have heard people say that according to Tarski, snow is white is true if and only if snow is white, is an instance of this schema. And in a way it is, because snow is white is a translation into the meta language of snow is white in the object language. What Bradwardine has really shown is that in order to apply Tarski's T-scheme to the liar paradox, this sentence is false. We shouldn't translate it. The translation is not given properly if we simply say this sentence is false is true if and only if this sentence is false, because that second occurrence of this sentence is false in the meta language doesn't actually capture everything that the object language sentence said. So to apply Tarski properly, you should say this sentence is false is true if and only if this sentence is false and this sentence is true, capturing everything it says.
Okay.
Right? But if you do that, you realize on the right-hand side you've got this sentence is false and this sentence is true, and that's a contradiction, impossible. On the left-hand side you've got this sentence is false is true, from which you can infer this sentence is false is not true. Right? Because you've got a contradiction on the right-hand side, so you must have a contradiction on the left when you said it was true, and so it follows that it's not true. So you actually applying Tarski properly, according to Bradwardine's principles, you get the same answer, that the sentence is false.
Right. So yeah, that was kind of one of my thoughts when I was first reading your paper, is that if you, it seems to me like what's really at the heart of it and what could be controversial is actually the closure principle, because we can just take the Tarski scheme to to say that whatever the P is actually everything that it says, right? So if it in fact says more than that, then that would have to be included into that. And
then plop, you've got the answer out. So you're right. The crucial thing that people get concerned about is the closure principle.
Right.
The closure principle seems to many people unnaturally strong. And it depends very much what your theory of following from or consequence is. When he says it must mean anything that follows from anything it means, then following from is taken in a fairly natural sense. You end up with true sentences all meaning the same thing and false sentences all meaning the same thing, namely everything true and everything false on the two sides.
Sorry, why would that be? Can you run through that last part again?
Now, why does this work? This is now trying to think other people's arguments against this. This is an argument that Greg Restall came up with, and it depends upon a certain sense of consequence, and that sense is given by a theory in the 20th century called the right theory of conditionals is given by something called material implication. Right. So an implication simply holds. An implication holds either if the antecedent is false or the consequent is true. Right. The only way a conditional can be false is for the antecedent to be true and the consequent false. Mm-hmm. Right. Well, that means that a theorem you can then prove is that. Let me get this the right way round, you want to say, of any two propositions, either one entails the other or the other entails the one. Or in symbols, if P then Q or if Q then P. This is sometimes thought to be a paradox of material implications. If you think that conditionals or implications are modeled by material implication, you have various paradoxical results. One is that any any conditional with a false antecedent is true, and any conditional with a true consequent is true. And you get this strange, of any two propositions, either the one implies the other or the other implies the one. Well, that's going to give you then the conclusion that you can divide all propositions into two classes. One implies the other and the other implies the one. And so everything that is the case is going to be meant by the true sentences, and everything that fails to be the case is going to be meant by the false sentences. That seems far too simplistic an account of truth.
Right. So there are only two things that can actually be said.
Yes, right. Exactly. But that. In a way, it's a further paradox of implication coming out of that. Also, I mean, it's also strange to think that any conditional, take any conditional, either it's true or its converse is true, seems a silly account of conditionals. So people give rather different, stronger, stricter accounts of conditionals, and then you don't have these worrying results out of Bradwardine, or not quite to the same extent out of Bradwardine's postulate. But I think the very fact that people put this forward as an objection to Bradwardine just shows how entrenched this account of conditionals is. People say they don't like it, and then they use it a lot of the time, but particularly when they're arguing against other people.
So that makes sense. So the material conditional means that any conditional will be either true or false, even if the antecedent and consequent, for example, seem to have absolutely nothing to do with each other.
Yes.
Whatever counterintuitive results come from that will apply to the conditional in general, not specifically to the Bradwardine solution.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
So part of the problem here is that apart from many, maybe not everyone, I wouldn't like to count everyone here, but many people thinking the material account of conditionals is wrong, there's no uniform agreement about what the right theory of conditionals is. Should it be famously Staunacker's account of conditionals, or should it be modal conditionals, or should it be relevant conditionals? Those are three theories on the market. Probably the Staunacker account is probably the one that gains the most acceptance at the moment. This is a theory due to a man called Robert Staunacker that says that a conditional is true if its consequent is true in the closest world in which its antecedent is true. So we think of this world, we think of all the possible worlds there are, we rank them in terms of similarity, and we look at the most similar world in which the antecedent is true, and we look to see if the consequent is true there.
Interesting. Okay.
It matches up closely with the material account of conditional in the case where the antecedent is true, but in the case where the antecedent is false, you're not going to, the material account then simply says the conditional is true. It won't hold in the Staunacker account. You'll need to go off to the closest world in which the antecedent is true and see whether the consequent holds there. And it might well not. In order to make the antecedent true, you might falsify the consequent.
Okay. Now, so one thing that had come to mind, but I think would fall under this umbrella of problems that are really a problem with the material conditional, is that one thing that I thought was this would mean that anything anything that you say included in what you're saying would be any tautology, right? Anything that sort of follows from anything.
Right. Yes. Well, that I think can be a problem with the Staunacker account. Staunacker account gets all the tautologous cases to come out here. The ones with tautologous consequence to turn out true, because if the consequence is tautology, it's going to be true in any world. So, if the antecedent's false and you've got to look at another world to find out whether the consequence is true, it will be true because the consequence is tautology. So it's one of the drawbacks of the standard account. Surprisingly, actually, that didn't worry Carnap. Carnap had an account here which actually an account of meaning, which actually said that the meaning of the statement is the class of its implications, where he actually just excluded the tautologous ones, take all the non-tautologous consequences, and that's the meaning of the sentence. So there are ways of trying to avoid that sort of trivializing of the whole thing.
So let me ask you this then. So I would count myself as somebody who, this account all makes sense and seems to work, except for where the closure principle does seem to me to be fairly counterintuitive. And even putting aside the problems that have to do specifically with the conditional or with something like tautologies, certainly it does imply that, in whatever most natural account we can take of implication, right? Whenever I say something, I am, at the same time as I'm saying this, saying all the things that we would think to follow from it, which means that I am presumably saying a number of things that I don't even know are true because I haven't worked out the implication.
Yes.
Perhaps even things that nobody knows are true. So do you have a sort of story or justification for making sense of that?
There's an answer to that, I think. Because you would have to admit that having made this claim, you are committed to all those things that you haven't thought of. If someone comes along and says, do you know it follows from what you said yesterday, that, and then gives you something you never thought of, right? You committed yourself to that. And in particular, they came along and said, and I've just shown that that's not the case. You would have to retract your statement. So you enter into these commitments when you're in some sense committed to anything that follows from what you said. So what's so very strange about saying that's what you meant? I think that's quite a beginnings of quite a strong defence. But people might still say, but you might not even have thought of these things. How could you? It's okay to say you're committed to them, but how could you actually have said them in some way if you weren't conscious of it? And I think an answer to that can be given by reference to some thoughts that Hilary Putnam had, which was that we use words like, say, elm and beech, even if we can't ourselves tell the difference between an elm and a beech. This was a famous case that Putnam said he couldn't actually tell the difference between an elm and a beech, but he relied on experts to do this for him, and thought that he was a competent user of English in using the words elm and beech, even if he couldn't actually distinguish them himself, but needed to rely on other people. Well, that's not 100 miles away from what we've seen Bradwardine saying here. You said this. It's part of what you incurred in what you said. So in a way, it's part of what you said in the way that differences between elms and beeches is something that's part of what you've entered into a whole story about distinguishing trees, even if it's not something you can do or even conscious of, and you rely on other people. And I think that goes some way to mitigate the strangeness of Bradwardine's view.
Isn't there going to be a difficulty about being able to distinguish between the various things that you may have meant? So, for example, I tell you something, and then I said something to you yesterday, and now today you said, "Hey, look, from what you said follows this, and that's not true." And I now want to say something like, "Oh, I guess I didn't realize that part. I meant the first part. I meant what I originally said. I didn't mean to include that other part." But if all of these, in fact, signify everything that follows from them, it seems that I'm in fact saying the same thing when I'm trying to distinguish between them.
Yeah, but we do this all the time. I mean, another example that occurs to me, is induction. Famously, induction allows you to infer generalizations from a limited number of instances. So, if I make some statement about all seagulls are noisy, because I've heard dozens and dozens of seagulls in St Andrews making a lot of noise, and I say all seagulls are noisy. I haven't been able to check all seagulls. But we all the time we make these generalizations based upon a limited amount of evidence, where we sort of look to see. I mean, the famous thing called Mills methods to make sure that the sample size you've used has been a reasonable one that would allow you to make this. Perhaps one would want to go stronger. Scientific theories are in some sense based upon inductions of this sort. But you make these claims, and then if someone points out, we've now discovered some black swans in Australia, so not all swans are white, even though everyone's been saying all swans are white for years. We have to say, well, all European swans are white. We qualify our statement. So you make your claim, someone points out eventually, they said, look, I found an implication of what you said that you wouldn't want to be committed to. You revise it, you put a qualifier into your statement. But we have to do this all the time. Life's too short to add the qualifiers all the time. We have to make the best claims we can.
That makes sense, but it's not exactly what I meant when I should have been a bit more clear with the question. So the question is more about being able to actually refer to the different things that one sentence signifies, because if I make some claim, right, and then I want to be able to parse out sort of different aspects of that claim. Say, that claim was made up of X and of Y. If X and Y have this, if they have the same implication, or if one follows from the other, then aren't I actually saying the same thing? Because in both of them is included everything that follows from them. I guess maybe this comes back to the problem of material implication. I'm not sure if there's anything extra to it, but I'm wondering whether this creates a difficulty for distinguishing semantically different aspects of a statement. If the moment you say any part of it, you are sort of automatically also saying anything that follows from it.
Yes, but I think what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to explore if there really is a significant distinction between what you're saying and what you're committed to, because you're certainly committed to these things when you said it. You will be held by the commitments of what you said, even if you're not aware, right? And you'll backtrack if you find that there's a commitment you don't want to stand by. Then you'll have to retract your original statement. Now, why is that so very different from actually saying you actually said these things in the first place? That's part of what you meant when you said it. I think I think the hesitation people have is they think somehow when I say something, its full meaning must be somehow before my mind. But that's just impossible. As I was trying to give with the point about elms and beeches, but it's a much bigger thing. We enter into this discourse where we depend on other people to know know what the distinctions are. I mean, I go into the phone shop and say I need a new SIM for my phone. I haven't a clue what a SIM is. Really, I rely on other people. I rely on the guy behind the counter to know what a SIM is and get one out of the drawer and stick it in my phone. But I use this word because I'm relying on other people to be experts, to know how to deal with it. But you couldn't say that's not what I meant. I meant a sin. No, I don't know what a sin is. Not even sure what sin is an abbreviation for. But it's part of the meaning of my statement that I'm referring to this thing. You're totally unconvinced.
So I think you're addressing the sort of pragmatics of it a bit, and I'm on board with you there, and I'm on board with the idea that I don't have to have everything in my mind in order to if I'm saying something, I don't necessarily have to have all of the contents of what it means when I say it. My concern is more that if two things, if it happens that two things have the same implications,
mm-hmm.
then it'll be as if they're literally just saying the exact same thing. Right? If two statements have the same implications, then it's as if they're saying the exact same things.
Yeah, what's wrong? It sounds very good principle to me.
That I guess what seems counterintuitive about it is that I was somehow be able to distinguish between these two things in the first place. So how was I able to distinguish between these two things, given that, according to the closure principle, they in fact meant the same thing completely.
Well, I only have your word for it that you did distinguish between them. I don't believe you did distinguish between them. If you thought you distinguished between them, you were wrong.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Is that too bold a response? You tell me I've distinguished these two things, but they have exactly the same implications. And I said, well, if you thought you distinguished them, you're wrong. If they got exactly the same implications, what's the difference?
Right. Yeah. Okay. That's fair. I mean, I'm thinking back to the liar sentence, and I sort of want to say that when I say this sentence is false,
mm-hmm.
Something that follows from that is that this sentence is also true. But I certainly have, let's just call it an intuition to say, but that's just something that follows from it. That's not what I meant when I said the sentence is false. And specifically, I would want to say this sentence is both true and false, means something different, though it may follow from this sentence is false. Now,
right. This is a further subtlety of Bradwardine's theory, which I haven't brought out yet, and a number of people get the wrong end of the stick about this. I mean, this sentence is false can't entail this sentence is true on Bradwardine's theory, because he wants to say that the sentence is false, and he doesn't want to say that it's true. He says it's simply false, and it doesn't follow from that it's true. If you think back to the argument we went through, the place where we used the closure principle was if this sentence is not true and P, then it's true. So its truth doesn't follow simply from its not being true. It follows from its not being true and all the other things it means. And of course, among the other things it means we now realize is that it's true. So clearly it follows that it's true from it's not true and it's true, right? But it doesn't follow that it's true from its being not true, because he wants to say it's not true and he wants to deny that it's true.
Sorry, yes. So
it's an easy slip to make, I'm afraid, but it's absolutely crucial to realize, the subtlety of Bradwardine. You always have to with these paradoxes. You're going as close to the edge as you can without falling over. And all the theories that people come up with, they're dicing with death right on the edge of this abyss where we're going to get involved in contradiction. But we have to think very carefully around that bend. And it doesn't, on Bradwardine theory, it doesn't follow from the fact that it's not true that it's true. Where we used that move in the argument, it was a more complicated step. Yeah, we used it in the first step of the argument when we assumed it only meant that it's not true, then it followed true. But of course, that was proving that it didn't only mean that it's not true. Once we'd realised it must mean something else, P, then it was from it's not being true and P, it followed that it's true. And that doesn't mean that it's true follows from it's not true. It needs the extra P as well.
Right. Yeah. That makes sense. Okay, so let me ask you just a couple, I think maybe just two more things. One is, I know that it, related to all this is, in your original paper about it, you talked about this idea that sentences imply their own truth, and that this would be a problem for the Bradwardine solution. In fact, it was one of the main things that you pointed out against the Bradwardine solution that came after. Now, and I'm not sure, so maybe just correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe since then you have in fact shown that from Bradwardine's principles, you can take it that sentences do imply their own truth?
I think there's an argument which seems to show that, and it does worry me, because I think if every sentence implied its own truth, then if we think about the truth principle, a sentence is true if everything it means is the case, then it's not going to get to be true without being true in the first place. I think it's a subtle question as to whether that's going to rule out truth or whether it simply means that we rely on the other things that it says to work out whether it's true. But the argument goes something like this. A sentence is true if everything it means is the case, right? So supposing everything it means is the case, then it's going to follow that it's true. But presumably a sentence does mean everything that it means. And so by the closure principle, it's also going to mean that it's true. So we've shown that any sentence means of itself that it's true. Maybe I should run through that again because I found that quite confusing as I said it, right?
Yeah, maybe just one more time.
The definition of truth says the sentence is true if everything it means is the case.
Right.
So then we seem to have a conditional. If everything it means is the case, then it's true. That seems to be a definition of truth, right? But surely a sentence does mean everything it means. And the closure principle says anything that follows from anything it means is something it means. But it follows from everything it means that it's true. And it does mean everything it means, so it follows that it means that it's true. So the closure principle seems to indicate that every sentence means of itself that it's true. That's the argument.
Right.
It's one of those now you see it, now you don't argument. It's actually quite difficult to pin down. But,
So what is your so where do you stand currently on that argument as it relates to the Bradwardine solution? Because I know that one of the things that you showed is that using the Bradwardine's theory of truth, if all sentences do imply their own truth, then that leaves the definition of truth, leaves it so that true statements will be indeterminate because they have to be true in order to be true.
Right.
So where does that? Where are you? Where do you stand on that now?
Where I stand in it, I mean, this is not anything that Bradwardine himself said or recognised, but it does seem to me to be a consequence of his theory. So we've got to say, is this consequence of his theory damaging to his theory? And I think my answer is a bit like relates quite closely to what you were saying in the way of objections just now. That if the theory is that whenever you say something, you are not only committed to it, but you mean anything that follows from it, then you're always, in a way, making a stab in the dark whenever you say anything. It's always hostage to fortune as to what's going to turn out to follow from what you said. Well, I think my answer is then, and that's equally true of making truth claims. if you say that something's true, you're making the hostage to fortune that everything that the sentence means is the case, among which is that it's true. So concentrate on the other stuff. And on the basis of that, if all the other stuff obtains, then indeed it will be true. The fact that it also means that it's true is a kind of byproduct of it, but nothing crucially damaging to the theory.
So in a way, you're sort of biting the bullet on the circularity of truth, and also saying that there's a way we can maybe just parse that out.
Exactly. Since it's simply a consequence of it meaning everything else that it means, then there can be no harm in simply looking to see whether everything else it means is the case, and then truth will come with it as a natural consequence.
Right. Great. So last question. Graham Priest has made a lot of this idea of a principle of unified solution. I think it is just the idea that any solution.
Principle of uniform solution.
Right. Yeah. Uniform solution. Yeah. Thank you. I thought I had the word wrong. That a solution to a paradox should really resolve all the paradoxes in the same family, whatever that may mean. And I know that he has used that as a challenge to the Bradwardine solution. What are your thoughts on that principle, and do you think that it is a problem for this solution?
Well, I don't think it's a problem for the solution, and I think it doesn't have the force that Graham would like it to have. So two things about it. One is it's actually equivalent to different solution, different paradox. So if we find that there are different solutions available, that in itself is going to show that they were different sorts of paradoxes. So I don't think it actually carries much weight at all. I discovered actually there's quite a discussion of this principle. There's an invocation of this principle in Aristotle when he's talking about some problems that we might think not the same sort of problem at all. He says, look at this fallacy. This dog is yours, therefore this dog is your father. Sorry, this dog is yours, this dog is a father, therefore this dog is your father. Now that looks like a silly little sophism, but what Aristotle does then is to say this has to have the same solution as the hidden man paradox. I don't know if you discussed that with Graham. Hidden man paradox is the man. There's a man approaching in a cloak, and you can't see who he is, but in fact he's your father, and you do know your father, so you do know the man approaching, even though you don't know who he is. Aristotle gets into a lot of discussion about these have to have the same solution. Now, I think most people, including Graham and me, would say these are completely different paradoxes. We've got to have different solution. So simply invoking this, they have to, if they're the same in the same family, they have to have the same solution. It depends whether you're right in seeing them in the same family in the first place. And you remember I said that the 20th century approached the paradoxes when they found them by distinguishing the set theoretic paradoxes from the semantic paradoxes, and gave them very, very different solutions. Some people think that was a crucial mistake, that they actually are so similar in their structure that they ought to have the same solution. But simply invoking some principle of universal solution has no force until we know whether they're in the same family or not. And the only way to find that out, really, is to find out how to solve them. Okay. If they have the same solution, they are in the same family. If they don't give in to the same solution, then they're in different families. It has no force.
Interesting. Okay, I hadn't thought of that. That makes sense. So then you would grant then that the Bradwardine approach isn't going to solve a lot of things, including Russell's paradox, including maybe Berry's paradox, but to you that just shows that those are not in fact in the same family.
See that at all? You've referred to this paper of Graham's in which he attacks the Bradwardine solution as saying that you can't apply it to the paradoxes of denotation like Berry's paradox. Well, a paper I wrote quite recently is for a collection in honour of Graham, which is close to going to press at the moment, in which I've actually applied. I've worked out. It took me a long time to do it because the paradoxes of denotation are very, very tricky paradoxes to deal with because you need to develop a theory of denotation. And a theory of denotation actually is a lot more complicated to work out than a theory of truth. Theory of truth, we gave these principles of Tarski's or of Bradwardine's, quite simple. But principle of denotation, what does a singular term designate or denote? It's quite tricky to develop a proper theory of that. But I worked out an account which will be published shortly, in which it was an eye-opener to me to see the extent to which Bradwardine's theory could be generalised in a way to deal with Berry's paradox and lots of other paradoxes in Hilbert-Benai's paradox and lots of other paradoxes, Berkeley's paradox, all the paradoxes that Graham comes up with there. It's great fun extending Bradwardine's theory to deal with that.
Oh, that's exciting. I really look forward to reading that. Okay, Stephen, thank you so much. I really appreciate this. This has been a great discussion, and you've been really generous with your time. I thank you.
Thank you indeed for inviting me, and I hope I've been as clear as I can be about this material, which is very, very difficult to do as a mental exercise, as opposed to writing it down. So thanks for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you. And that concludes today's episode of Who Shapes the Barber? Next week, I'll speak with prison abolitionist Jason Lee Bias about theories of justice and punishment. Again, I'm William Nava. You can check out other episodes, as well as my other philosophical and artistic work at williamnava.com. And if you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, go to williamnava.podbean.com. Thank you so much for listening.